Welcome to History Date Night, a World War II podcast covering the Second World War in chronological order, from the opening shots to final victory. I'm Justin, and joining me is my wife and co-host, Jennie. Together we explore the people, battles, and turning points that shape the deadliest conflict in human history, one date at a time. On this episode,
Norway pays the price for this.
The German High Command is having its own crisis.
It gets worse before it gets better.
Which is operationally impossible.
Welcome back to History Date Night. I'm Justin. Last episode we covered two brutal naval battles at Narvik, 6 days apart. The first major warship ever sunk by aircraft alone. And Quisling's rise and very quick fall from power inside a single week. This episode covers April 16th through the 20th. The Allies actually start putting real numbers of troops ashore in Norway and immediately run into a level of logistical chaos that would almost be funny if the stakes weren't so serious. We'll also tell you about one of the great ironies of the entire campaign. British codebreakers crack the German Enigma code, being used in Norway, this very week, and yet it changes almost nothing.
I'm Jennie. This episode also has a one-eyed, one-handed Victoria Cross veteran arriving in Norway to command troops who show up without their equipment. A future top U-boat ace beginning his most famous command. A German high command so dysfunctional that one general storms out of a planning meeting. And a diary entry from a refugee that captures exactly how ordinary German soldiers made sense of what they were doing. Let's get into it.
By April 16th, the main body of the British 24th Guards Brigade has landed at Harstad, north of Narvik, and the 146th Brigade is coming ashore in Namsos. I think that's what it's called. The small port north of Trondheim. 2 days later, on the 18th, the 148th Brigade lands further south at Åndalsnes. This is the first time real numbers of Allied troops are actually on Norwegian soil in force, and almost immediately, the campaign reveals just how improvised the entire effort has been.
The man commanding the Namsos landing is a remarkable character. Major General Sir Adrian Carton de Weert is a stiff-backed veteran who left Oxford to enlist during the Boer War. He wears a black patch over an eye, lost in the Middle East, an artificial hand, replacing one lost in the First World War, and a chest full of medals that includes the Victoria Cross. He arrives at Namsos by flying boat ahead of his own troops to scout the ground, and discovers immediately that the fjord leading into the port is far too narrow and winding for the bulky troop transports to navigate safely, under threat of Luftwaffe attack. Much of his brigade has to be hastily transferred to destroyers instead. In the confusion, one transport inadvertently sails back to Britain with 170 tons of weapons, rations, and ammunition still aboard, leaving his troops with barely 2 days of supplies. Even Carton de Weert's own brigade commander goes briefly missing. It turns out he's aboard a different ship, one that's steaming toward Narvik instead of Namsos.
The pattern repeats everywhere. French chasseurs à panne, or elite mountain troops, land at Namsos this week without the leg bindings needed to actually use their skis, and British troops arrive without adequate anti-air weapons. And at Åndalsnes, Brigadier Morgan receives openly conflicting orders on the same day. One telling him to march his men 80 miles to the north to help retake Trondheim, and another telling him to march south to reinforce Norwegian positions defending the Good... and forgive me for my Norwegian pronunciation, Gudbrandsdal Valley, the Gudbrandsdal Valley. Norwegian General Otto Ruge, rather than merely requesting help, essentially demands that Morgan's brigade moves south to consolidate the Norwegian line named Lillehammer. Instead of continuing toward Trondheim, Morgan complies.
It doesn't go smoothly even once decided. On April 19th, the British 146th Brigade, which had pushed south from Namsos towards Steinkjer, is forced to retreat back the way it came. The same day sees the first direct clash between British and German ground troops in the entire war, at a place called Verdal, north of Trondheim, where the 146th Brigade and Norwegian troops engaged the German 138th Mountain Regiment. And at Donbass, the German paratroopers who had landed almost directly on top of a Norwegian infantry camp the week before finally run out of options. 45 of them surrender to Norwegian forces, and the Battle of Donbass ends as a clear Norwegian tactical victory, even if it's a small one in the context of everything else going on.
On April 17th before dawn, the British heavy cruiser HMS Suffolk sails in to bombard the German-held airfield at Sula, near Stavanger. The airfield, whose capture on the very first day of the invasion has been giving the Luftwaffe such an enormous advantage across the entire southern half of Norway. The bombardment doesn't go well. Suffolk's own spotter seaplane, sent up to drop flares over the target, is shot down almost immediately, which means the bombardment that follows is largely blind and inaccurate. Around 4 German aircraft are actually destroyed on the ground. Then, after sunrise, German bombers find Suffolk on her way home and hit her twice. She barely limps back to Scapa Flow, and she's out of action for repairs until February of the following year. This is a serious lesson in exactly what happens to a warship operating without air cover of its own within range of land-based bombers, a lesson that we will see repeated in this war.
HMS Furious, the one carrier the Royal Navy actually has in home waters. The ship that's been fighting this entire campaign with a badly reduced air group, takes her own hit on April 18th. While threading through the narrow port of Gratsund Fjord near Tromsø, a single German Focke-Wulf Condor drops 2 bombs. One lands close enough to badly whip the ship's hull and damage turbine blades. She keeps operating for now, but the damage will eventually force her home for proper repairs too. Between Suffolk and Furious, the week makes brutally clear just how exposed British ships are in these waters. Without the kind of sustained air cover, the Royal Navy just simply does not have available to get them.
And on April 18th, in a German shipyard far from any of this, the submarine U-99 is commissioned under command of Kapitänleutnant Otto Kretschmer. We first mentioned Kretschmer back in episode 23 when he was commanding U-23 and sank HMS Daring in the North Sea. U-99 is the boat that will make him famous. By the time she's finally cornered and sunk in March of the next year, Kretschmer will have become the highest-scoring U-boat commander by tonnage sunk, earning the nickname Silent Otto for his habit of attacking on the surface at night, right in the middle among the convoy ships where the hydrophones can't easily detect him. None of that has happened yet. This week he's just taken command of a new boat, but we could think it's worth noting because we'll be coming back to him.
April 15th, which is actually the last day of this episode's window, but the story really belongs here. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park break into the Enigma traffic being used by both the German Luftwaffe and Army for the Norwegian campaign. It's a relatively uncomplicated key by later wartime standards, and the volume of messages flowing through it is enormous. Some intercepts take less than an hour to decrypt from the moment they're intercepted to readable German text. The material covers organization, supply routes, invasion plans, unit intentions, the kind of comprehensive picture of enemy operations that Churchill will later call golden eggs.
Here's the problem. British intelligence in April 1940 has absolutely no established system for actually getting this information to the commanders in the field who could use it. There's no secured channel built yet to pass decoded Enigma intelligence down to Army and Navy commanders without revealing that the code itself has been broken. There is no formal process for collating the material or deciding what's urgent versus what's merely interesting. As one historian summarizes it bluntly, the breaking of the Norway Enigma key, however extraordinary a cryptographic achievement, had essentially no influence on the actual course of the Norwegian campaign. Britain wins the intelligence war in Norway and loses almost everything else. It's an important lesson, and Britain does learn it. By the time we reach the Battle of Britain and beyond, the pipeline from Bletchley to the front lines will exist and will matter tremendously. But it doesn't exist yet, and Norway pays the price for this and other Allied unpreparedness.
Meanwhile, the German High Command is having its own crisis, and it has nothing to do with code breaking. After the destruction of the German destroyer flotilla in the Second Battle of Narvik, General Alfred Jodl records in his diary that Hitler suffers what Jodl calls a fit of hysteria, demanding at one point that General Dietl's surrounded troops at Narvik simply be evacuated by air, which is operationally impossible given the aircraft and airfields actually available. Jodl writes, each piece of bad news leads to the worst fears. Hitler recovers enough within a day or two to instead order Dietl to hold Narvik as long as possible before withdrawing into the interior if necessary.
It gets worse before it gets better. A few days later, Jodl records a, quote, renewed crisis. The German envoy in Oslo, Kurt Brauer, is recalled after his diplomatic efforts to legitimize the occupation fail, and Hitler concludes that force alone will now have to settle matters. The conference of the Chancellery, Jodl writes, becomes so bitter, with heads of the Army, Navy, and Air Force each blaming the others for delays and failures, that even Field Marshal Keitel, a man not exactly known for standing up to Hitler, simply walks out of the room. Quote, chaos of leadership is again threatening, end quote, Jodl notes. This is a useful corrective to any picture of the German war machine in 1940 as a smoothly functioning, perfectly coordinated instrument. It's not that. Not even close. Not even during a campaign that is, by most measures, still going quite well for Germany.
On the British side, there's a parallel story of indecision. On April 17th, the War Cabinet approves plans for a direct amphibious assault on Trondheim itself, Operation Hammer, to be supported by the landings already underway at Namsos and Åndalsnes on either flank. By April 20th, the cabinet has cancelled it, worried about the casualties a direct assault against a well-defended port would likely produce. The reversal leaves the 146th Brigade, already committed near Trondheim, in a precarious position with no clear plan for what comes next. Both sides, in their own ways, are discovering this week just how hard it is to run a war by committee under pressure. While the Allies argued over how to liberate Norway, the Germans were busy deciding how to govern it.
Last episode, Quisling had been quietly removed from his self-declared position on April 15th. German Ambassador Kurt Brauer had been maneuvering against Quisling almost from the moment he declared himself Prime Minister, recognizing within days that a man with no popular support and no seats in Norway's own legislature was a liability, not an asset. Hitler writes to Quisling personally, thanking him for his service and vaguely promising him some position in whatever government structure comes next, which is not close to the same thing as being the head of state. Power passes instead to an administrative council of 7 men, chaired by Ingolf Christensen, and drawn partly from members of Norway's own Supreme Court, in the hope that a body with some genuine domestic legitimacy might actually be able to work with King Haakon's government rather than against it. By the end of this week, to the world at large, Quisling is understood as both a traitor and a failure, which is an unfortunate combination for him.
Ruth Meyer is an Austrian Jewish refugee who fled the Nazis and found safety in Norway. Safety that will not last. She will die in Auschwitz 2 years from now, though she has no way of knowing that yet. She writes in her diary about watching German soldiers in Oslo explain to local Norwegians that Poland had killed 60,000 German civilians before Germany was forced to invade Poland in self-defense. A Norwegian bystander asked the soldiers, quite directly, whether they genuinely believe they're in Norway to protect the Norwegians. The soldiers answer, according to the local papers, that they're actually there to protect Norway from the British. And this, Meyer noted, they do seem to sincerely believe.
It's the same propaganda we've discussed before in this series regarding Poland. To the rest of the world, naked, unprovoked aggression. To the ordinary German soldier carrying it out, a defensive necessity, because that's what the newspapers and the radio have told them every single day for months. The Norwegians themselves are recorded as displaying what one historian calls implacable hostility to their invaders. Not open resistance in most cases, simply an absolute refusal to accept the cover story being offered them, even while living under German occupation and unable to do anything meaningful about it.
A few threads worth tracking outside Norway this week. General Maxine Weygand reports to General Gamelin and to General Vuillemin, commander of the French Air Force, that preparations for the planned bombing raid on the Caucasian soil fields, the Baku operation that we've been tracking since episode 29, have advanced far enough that the French High Command formally decides to prepare for attacks on the Soviet Union's oil infrastructure by the end of June or the beginning of July 1940. It's a remarkable decision to be making in the middle of April. France and Britain, still not at war with the Soviet Union, are now setting an actual target window for bombing it, specifically to cut off oil that's currently flowing to Germany under the Molotov-Ribbentrop trade agreement.
In Denmark, there's a strange bit of bureaucratic theater. The Norwegian government formally reaffirms that a state of war exists with Germany this week after several days of active fighting, making official what's already happening on the ground. Meanwhile, in occupied Denmark, which surrendered without a real fight back on April 9th, the Danish army begins demobilizing because Germany's own public justification for the invasion requires pretending Denmark is a cooperative partner rather than a conquered enemy. 2 Scandinavian countries invaded on the same morning end this week in almost opposite legal and military postures.
In China, the war that has been running since well before any of this began continues grinding on. Japanese forces under General Tadatoshi have built moats, walls, and European-style concrete pillboxes along key railway lines in the Shaanxi region, trying and largely failing to stop persistent Chinese guerrilla attacks. This month, Japan's First Army issues new orders to destroy Chinese forces throughout southern Shaanxi and, in their words, quote, paralyze their activities at the source. Language that shows Japan is no closer to actually finishing this war than it was months or years ago, despite years of occupation and enormous resources committed.
And back in London, 10 million Londoners, the largest concentration of potential bombing targets in Europe, are still waiting for an air raid that hasn't come. The city is full of sandbags piled around windows and doorways, weathering now to green and starting to leak at the corners. In the wealthy areas of Belgravia and Mayfair, the wealthy have largely fled to the countryside. In one square, only 6 houses out of 120 remain occupied. And estate agents' boards go up with no takers. But in the city of London itself, business has almost entirely returned to normal. Most of the 3,500 firms that evacuated back in September have returned, and office workers fill the streets, hardly one of them bothering to carry a gas mask anymore. At the National Gallery, the actual paintings are stored safely in a Welsh slate quarry. But the empty building is packed every lunchtime with people who came for the pianist Myra Hess's free concerts. Barrage balloons hang in the evening sky over Hyde Park, and one observer, without irony, describes them as looking almost romantic, like pearls strung from the clouds.
A few last grace notes. On April 16th, Bob Feller of the Cleveland Indians pitches a no-hitter against the Chicago White Sox on opening day. To this day, the only opening day no-hitter in Major League history. On the same day, in Copenhagen, a baby girl is born who will grow up to become Queen Margrethe II of Denmark, arriving into the world in the very city her country surrendered from 1 week earlier. On April 18th, Gone with the Wind has its London premiere across 3 West End cinemas simultaneously, to warm, if not ecstatic, reviews. And on April 20th, Adolf Hitler turns 51. Germany's High Command issues a secret order the same week discharging servicemen of mixed Jewish heritage and those married to Jewish women. Hitler, now in a good mood for his birthday, despite his earlier nervous worries, orders the creation of the SS Regiment Nordland, which would later evolve into the famous multinational SS Division Nordland.
So to wrap up, Allied troops finally land in Norway in real numbers, and immediately discover skis without bindings, missing anti-aircraft guns, and commanders receiving contradictory orders. HMS Suffolk and HMS Furious both take serious damage operating without air cover. Bletchley Park breaks into the Norway Enigma traffic, and it changes almost nothing, because Britain hasn't built the means to use it yet. Hitler has what Jodl calls a fit of hysteria over Narvik, recovers, and then his own high command nearly comes apart at the seams days later. Quisling is formally finished, replaced by an administrative council nobody really trusts either. France sets a target window to bomb Soviet oil fields, and London waits sandbagged and strangely calm for a bombing raid that still hasn't arrived. Next episode, the Norwegian campaign continues to grind forward, and we'll see exactly what happens when General Maxey's caution at Narvik comes home to roost. Thanks for joining us for episode 32 of History Date Night. You can follow us on social media where we post this day in history for World War II. We'll see you next time.
See you then.